Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today, let's talk about Track 2 diplomacy. I'm not much of a diplomat, but I've got one on hand now, somebody who's a Track 2 guy. This is Professor Peter Jones of the University of Ottawa in the Graduate School of, I don't know, what did you say it was, Peter?
Well, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs.
Sounds good. All right. So the way I know him a little bit is through Pugwash. I've been a member of Pugwash for something like 40 years, and he says about 20 some. And I know that he's done actually some Track 2 diplomacy through Pugwash. And in a way, you can say that Pugwash itself is kind of a setup for Track 2 kinds of activities in various contexts, because it was an organization set up during the Cold War to facilitate conversations between East and West. And it's continued to be an international organization with conferences and dialogues and so on. It did some very good work, especially during the Cold War, and was recognized with the Nobel Prize. So we're going to talk about this whole thing of Track 2 diplomacy, which is his bag. Good morning, Peter. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Good. Okay. Now I won't even attempt to tell people what it is, because you're better at giving a course on Track 2 diplomacy. So let's have a mini course on Track 2 diplomacy this morning.
Okay, sure. You probably all heard, a prime minister or a president or a foreign minister stand up in Parliament and say, "We will never talk to," and then insert IRA, PLO, whatever you wish. And so there is this position that governments take, that they will never talk to adversaries. But we know, in fact, historically, they do all the time. Israel talks to Hamas. The British talked to the IRA for many years. The apartheid government of South Africa talked to the African National Congress. And they do it through a mechanism which goes by various names: back channel diplomacy, Track 2 diplomacy. Essentially, it's the business of facilitating conversations between people who otherwise couldn't. They couldn't because they don't recognize each other officially, or because even though they may recognize each other, they've sworn that they'll never talk to the other side about a particular issue. India and Pakistan will never talk about Kashmir. Well, they do talk about Kashmir. They talk about it in Track 2. So it's a way of having these kind of discussions. So one way to think about Track 2 is on different levels, if you like. The kind of talks that I've been just describing, sort of semi-official, clandestine, between people affiliated with governments or movements, sometimes in the field we call that Track 1.5 or back channel. It's a kind of discussion that's almost but not quite an official discussion. And then there's
people who are in these conversations are themselves government officials, but they're not publicly letting anybody know that they're talking. Is that it?
Right. Yeah. Sometimes they're government officials. Sometimes they might be, retired officials, but still very close to government. Sort of, they're there really on behalf of the government, but the fact of the talks is secret. And very often they'll be hosted and facilitated by an organization like the one I run, the Ottawa Dialogue, so that they're portrayed, if they ever become public, as academic conversations. They're not official. We're not negotiating with those people. That's the sort of way that that's done. And then another level is more classically Track 2, which is, it's not secret, but it's not public, but it is conversations between influential citizens of different countries or different movements. But it's more, it's not necessarily negotiations over specific things. It's more general relationship building and talking about how one day we may progress towards a peace treaty. And so one way to think of that is that for many, many years between Israelis and Palestinians, there were Track 2 talks going on around the world. And they eventually, when the time was right, became a Track 1.5 in Oslo, which then eventually led to the Oslo Agreement. So it was a progression, right? I mean, eventually these talks that had gone on for many years, which were not secret but not public, between Israeli academics and people close to the government and people close to the PLO, eventually became talks between Israeli government officials and PLO officials, but not official talks, facilitated by the government of Norway, and then eventually official diplomacy. A third level that we sometimes talk about is what we call track 3. And that is much more civil society to civil society and is very often public. And so, very often you'll have situations between countries or groups in conflict where you'll have meetings of, artists, women's groups, business people coming together to try to develop proposals, ideas, ways to advocate on behalf of a relaxation in tensions. And so again, I do a fair bit of work in the India-Pakistan context, and I'm not involved myself, but there's an awful lot of track 3. There's an awful lot of meetings of Indian and Pakistani business people to say, well, if we could trade openly, the economy of both countries would be, enhanced, or groups of artists or filmmakers or women's groups to sort of advocate on behalf of better relations. But track 3 is much more public, and it's meant to be, and it's meant to be more advocacy, really.
Well, now tell me, to me, I read your paper where you make these distinctions, but to me, the boundaries between the 3 are very blurry. And
they're elastic.
I'm trying to think, well, what is Pugwash? Is it track 2 or 3?
Well, the boundaries are very elastic, and these, depending on the kind of meeting you're running, you could be doing any one of these things. I personally, most of what it does, I would call Pugwash track 2, which is to say it's sort of influential people who are, primarily interested in security and arms control issues and nuclear disarmament, as it was in the Cold War for the most part, and who are seeking to influence their governments, who are meeting quietly. Sometimes the work they do, they deliberately decide to make public in order to sort of advocate on behalf of but sometimes it's deliberately kept very quiet and only given to the respective governments to show possible ways forward. So I think Pugwash is a very good example of an organization that does a bit of all 3 of these things, and it just depends on the role it's taking at a particular time, and how it goes about its business. But over its history, it's done all 3 of these things.
The Cold War, some of the people, the influential Pugwashites, were actually members of the government.
Yep.
I don't know, it wasn't the Duma in those days, but whatever. They had very high positions.
Yep.
In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something.
Yep. Yeah, there's a book by a professor at Cornell named Matthew Evangelista.
Yes,
and it's called Unarmed Forces, and it's a history of the Pugwash movement during the Cold War, and so it goes into all this. It's very good.
Yes, I have the book. I used to know Matthew. In fact, I wrote a book about this. My book was called "The Russian Quest for Peace," the Russian Quest for Peace and Democracy, I guess it was. But and it covered a lot of those interactions. So Matthew and I compared notes sometimes.
Yeah. There was another organization called the Dartmouth Conferences, which was named after a university in the northeastern U.S. where they began having a series of these kinds of meetings, and they'd have working. It's still going on. Russia, U.S. set of working groups. Yeah.
Alive. In fact, that's interesting that it still exists, because I kind of,
to my knowledge, anyway.
I wasn't aware that it still existed. Okay. There's certainly a lot of room for it now, but I don't think there's much hope of that. You want to talk a little about what would you even consider trying something right now with 2 governments that are so far apart as Russia and, let's say, the rest of the Western world, not just Ukraine, but EU and so on. It would seem to me to be a very daunting prospect.
Oh yeah. Well, you can't do this kind of work unless you're prepared to accept daunting prospects. Because for most of the history of these dialogues, even the ones that have succeeded, South Africa was an example of a track 2 process or processes that eventually contributed significantly to the end of apartheid. And I've mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian, Mozambique, the Cold War. There are examples of these things, but they went on for a very long time, and very often the sort of the public face of them. We now know that, just before Nelson Mandela was released, there was a series of track 1.5 meetings in England that were sponsored by a British company. which had interests in South Africa. And those are now known. They've been talked about and written about. But what's not known, there's a very good book just out by a professor at Oxford named Liz Carmichael, was for years and years and years, there were all kinds of quiet discussions going on between.
I know Liz Carmichael, but I didn't know she had a new book.
Just written a book on the South African peace process, and there's a whole chapter on the contribution made over several decades, largely by the religious community in South Africa on both sides. And, the Dutch Reformed Church and other people on the the Anglican Church and so on, sponsoring dialogues. But it went on for a long time, and for most of it, you would have said, yeah, well, that's all very nice, but no change is possible, nothing's going to happen. But they kept going, and eventually, some of the contacts and the ideas sort of blossomed. When the political circumstances caught up, and that we see that over and over again. So, to go back to your question, if I was to do something, and there is discussion going on between Russians and Americans and so on right now, it would be very much at this point with the view that I'm not going to be contributing to the end of the war in Ukraine. That's going to happen, militarily and diplomatically. But this is much more about, well, what kind of a relationship is Russia going to have with the West in the next 10, 15, 20 years? And the answer is not knowable. But the point is that, bringing together people to start considering it, and talking about it, and thinking about it is vitally important precisely at these kinds of moments. But it's difficult to do.
When I was visiting Russia doing that kind of interactions, I found that there were people in the government who were supposed to be official. They were party members, big time party members, and who were very much hoping for some real changes and very much for democracy and so on. I mean, Gorbachev was not alone. He was part of a movement, and we didn't know about it on the West. Very many people didn't know about it. But when I ask people now, like I asked Michael McFaul, is there a comparable kind of contrary movement within Putin's entourage now? He's thought not, that you couldn't find anybody who would actually go take any chances in terms of even whispering malcontent behind his back, that there just isn't that kind of movement now. I don't know. Would you be in a position to have heard?
I'm afraid I don't know. I'm not really an expert on Russia. But if you can't find people within the system who are disposed to have these kinds of conversations, this system won't be here forever. And there are potentially people who might rise in the next system. Now, this becomes very dangerous because for them, they're being watched, and it's very difficult to have these kinds of conversations. So it might be at this exact moment with the conflict in Ukraine, it might be difficult to have these kinds of conversations, and people might not be willing to take the risk. But the point is that at some point in time, there'll be a need to reach out and try to find the individuals with whom you could have a conversation. The other thing is, if you think of these different levels, track 1.5, track 2, track 3, probably at the track 1.5 level, there may well be some people around Putin who'd love to have a conversation. But it's going to be more about how do we manage the situation. And, they're looking to sort of remain in power and maybe extricate themselves from the mess they put themselves in and things like that. And so the question for people who do this is, do I help to facilitate that kind of a conversation with these really horrendous people who've done terrible things, but who may, if the deal is right, be willing to back off and yet remain in power, and so it becomes a bit of a moral conundrum in that. It's very easy to say, well, I only talk to people who represent the light and the pure and want change, and I'll have conversations with them, but people are being killed now. So do you have conversations with the killers to try and reduce that? It's a real conundrum for the field.
Right. Well, the thing that I'm trying to encourage is that I believe 700,000 men left Russia after mobilization, and they're scattered everywhere now. And really, that is a promising place to have some really serious conversations. They're not used to that. they don't themselves just spontaneously start getting together and planning what kind of new government they want. But that's where the most promising conversations could take place, because they're out of the country. Of course, their families are still there, and they may be cautious about that, but still, I think that's a hopeful sign that maybe they can have conversations by Zoom everywhere in the world, get it set up.
Yeah, that may be an area. I mean, I personally don't work on that part of the world, but that may be an area to, as you say, begin planting some seeds and developing some relationships. But that's more of a long-term payoff. It's not going to necessarily reduce the fighting right now.
That'd be your track 3, right? That's what you would mean by track 3.
Well, it would depend. If you were doing it sort of relatively publicly and trying to bring together coalitions of people to publicly put pressure on the Russian government to change its policies and to advocate a new course, then yes. I mean, if it was a case of quietly reaching out and trying to find people who could be leaders in a sort of a future Russian government, whatever it might be, they might not want to be so public right now. They might want to be talking quietly, but still willing to talk and try to understand what they might do. So that might be a more confidential kind of dialogue. It would really depend on what you were trying to accomplish.
Tell us, now you run this Ottawa Dialogue. Tell me what it is, for one thing. I mean, it's not just you, it's some other folks too, right? And what do you do?
Well, we have a staff right now of about 10. It fluctuates up and down depending on what we're doing. And we're very much within the University of Ottawa. So we're a university-based organization. And we're very much involved in running Track 2 dialogues in various parts of the world, some Track 1.5, but also doing research and publishing and holding workshops and conferences on what Track 2 is. So if you go to our webpage, www.ottawadialogue.ca, we're described. And if you go to the resources page, we publish 3 or 4 times a year a series of papers called policy briefs about different aspects of this field and how it works and what the best practices are and so on. We have a research department headed by a very, very active young PhD named Julia Palmiano-Federer, a Canadian but who lives in Europe, and she and her team are sponsoring writing and research, and I do writing on the field and how it works. So we do an awful lot of trying to understand what Track 2 is and working with others who work in this field. We're part of an international organization called the Mediation Support Network, which is a group of NGOs who do this kind of work. It's based in Switzerland, and we get together once a year and talk about our sorrows and victories and exchange notes and sort of. So there's a whole sort of public side of what we do in terms of trying to understand Track 2 and develop the field, because it's still a relatively little understood form of conflict resolution and mediation. And then we have this sort of more operational side of quietly running these dialogues in different parts.
Now, are you officially part of the University of Ottawa as an institute, or are you independent?
No, we're part of the University of Ottawa.
Okay. Now you say you have projects going on. I presume that when you publish a paper, you're not disclosing much about what is actually ongoing, but reflecting on general principles, or maybe telling the story of what did happen. Is that
right? Correct? Exactly. Yeah. I mean, where the participants in our dialogues are willing to make some sort of public proposal, we do that, but only if they are willing and they are comfortable. And that doesn't happen very often. Usually on that side, the ideas that come out of the workshops we hold, they're given to the 2 governments or the 2 organizations for them to consider. But when we do our publishing and writing, we talk about, as you say, general principles, best practices, a lot of work on looking at for example, we just published a policy paper by a European scholar, Andreas Herblinger, who's looking at the potential application of sort of new communications technologies and artificial intelligence to how peace processes can be run virtually. And so that's one of our policy papers. A little while ago, we published a policy paper by an Israeli scholar named Lior Lers, who looked back on Oslo, because Oslo is 30 years ago now, and he looked back on the different narratives and explanations and understandings that exist of what happened in Oslo, and how, you know, history and time and a certain amount of credit claiming and all the rest of it is causing there to be a whole series of different narratives of what Oslo actually was. And so he sort of disentangles those and looks at what that kind of historiographical, if that's a word, historiography is a word, I know that, what that has done to the field of Track 2 and our understanding of it. So there's a variety of things we publish like
Excuse my
that.
saying this,
Yeah.
but I'm surprised that anybody would be wanting to boast about Oslo, because it looked good at the time, but I don't think much has happened that makes you think
Well,
a great
yeah, I
triumph.
mean, it's not a question, I think, of boasting. It's a question of trying to understand. And Oslo is a very interesting case of in this
Yeah.
field that I work in, because, as you say, at the time it was the great success, right? I mean, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And you know, as time has gone by, not so much. So the question is, well, is that the fault of Track 2, or is it because the ideas that were inherent in the talks in Oslo, they weren't implemented by each side? And so you say, well, Track 2 did its job, but then the governments took over and you know, failed to implement. Obviously, there's arguments.
And what I'd like
either
to
way.
ask you is, if you were running it and you were picking it up and carrying it forward now, how would you change it? Only I think I shouldn't ask you that, because I think you may actually be doing that, and I'm not supposed to talk about it.
Well, I mean, the other thing that Oslo did was it changed the reality. I mean, you know, before Oslo, it was illegal for Israelis to talk to members of the PLO. And I mean, now there's the Palestinian Authority, which is not a country, but is a kind of quasi-government. And Israelis and members of the PA talk to one another all the time. And so, you know, there's an altered reality on the ground that really directly stems from Oslo. Now, it's not the reality we'd hoped for. And, you know, things seem to be going in a rather poor direction right now. But I mean, I think where we are right now is there's a variety of different views as to the potential way forward. There are still those, and you know, a decreasing number, who believe in this concept of the two-state solution, and that, you know, Israel and Palestine living side by side and so on. So there's some talks going on to try to fathom how that would work, and you know, are there things that can be done to encourage that? And by the way, that still is the official position of most of the international community.
Well,
there's a growing number of people who don't believe it anymore.
Well, I gather, I'm inferring, maybe incorrectly, that you are not one of those people who believe that it has much hope.
Probably incorrectly, actually. The thing about the two-state solution is that it's probably the least hopeful of the solutions on offer, but it's the only real solution. Because the other idea that's now out there is what's increasingly being called the one-state solution, which is that somehow this area, which comprises Israel and the occupied territories, becomes one country, and that you have the two different communities sort of governing themselves within one unit, or you have a demographic nightmare where eventually the Palestinians outnumber the Israelis and demand to take over, and there's, you know, enormous bloodshed and violence and so on. So there's a variety of different dialogues going on, sponsored by different people, looking at different aspects of that. So
Okay.
you asked me what I would do. I would be still plugging away, however, you know, regretfully and so on, trying to see if the two-state solution has a future.
Okay. I won't quarrel with you. I have given up hope.
But I don't hold out a lot of hope.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's difficult. Okay, now I keep derailing you from the original request, which is give us a little how to do it lecture. What is it, if you were training people to do Track 2 diplomacy, what are the instructions?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to decide what level you're working at. You know, Track 3, Track 2, Track 1.5, and you have to decide what are the objectives. You know, do you want to sort of help to manage a conflict, which means to say it's not going to be ended, but it'll at least be a lower level of violence, and so. Do you want to try and resolve the conflict? Do you want to try and transform the underlying situation that caused the conflict in the first place. Those are all very different objectives. And so the kind of track two you run, the kind of people you bring to the table, those are all the sorts of things you have to think about and have in your own mind a fairly clear picture of what you're trying to do. And then you have to start saying to yourself, well, okay, what are my, we call them in the field, entry points? How do I enter the conflict? How do I persuade people at whatever the appropriate level is, for whatever the appropriate objective is, to come to the table and start talking to one another? And very often that's a matter of personal connections, having a reputation as someone who does this kind of thing, but it's very time consuming. You have to go and meet people and talk to people and establish a real sort of rapport of trust and so on. And you have to sort of find the right people for the right level and the right set of objectives that you're pursuing. And then when you finally, you have to raise the money, which is not easy. And you have to sort of approach the funders of this sort of thing, which are a select number of governments and foundations. It's not terribly expensive, as compared to the cost of flying a jet fighter for 2 hours, but it still costs money. So you have to do that, and you have to manage it. You have to show a certain competency in managing funds and so on. And in the Ottawa Dialogue, we have, as I say, we have a staff of about 10 right now, and we have people who are, administrative coordinators and who do this kind of thing. And it's very important. The funders want to know that their money is being spent properly and in accordance with their, national requirements and so on. And so competency in managing the kind of international dialogue project is an important part of what you do. So assuming you've decided on the level you want to work at, and you've brought people in who are willing to talk, and you raise the funds and all this sort of stuff, then you have to start saying, well, what kinds of meetings do I want to have? In the classic world of sort of track 2, track 1.5, which is what we do in the Ottawa Dialogue, the key.
Sorry, you do primarily track 1.5?
Track 2, track 1.5, that area, sort of the as you say, the fungible gap, the fungible boundary between the two. And so the key concept for how you run these meetings and what you try to accomplish in these meetings is what is known as problem solving. And what is meant by that is that when you get two groups of people together who are from a long-standing conflict, a long-standing intractable conflict, when they sit down together, the natural tendency is to start bargaining, start negotiating, right? And they either negotiate over particular issues between them, or they even negotiate over their narratives. I mean, my narrative of pain and suffering is worse than yours, and they start going on and living the conflict, and and that's pretty pointless. I mean, that's what got them there. And so what you're trying to stimulate is a different approach on the part of the people at the meeting, and you're trying to gently lead them to a place where they begin to, together as a group, regard the conflict between them as a problem, and a problem they need to work together to try and solve. And that's why, generally speaking, that the kinds of meetings we have are called in the literature problem-solving workshops. And the approach of track 2 is a problem-solving approach. And so you're trying to create a kind of a, you have these people, and maybe half a dozen from each side, maybe 8, usually not more than that. And to create a sense of a group dynamic and a sense that they're working together to jointly identify the issues of a problem and then propose solutions. But this takes time. I mean, track 2 dialogues last years. All these track 2s that were going on between Israelis and Palestinians and South Africans and members of the African National Congress and so on, they took many years. And the slow process of making that change of approach, which was largely the sort of the third-party facilitator's job to try and quietly do that, takes a long time. So that's what we would do. Now, if you're running a track 3 and you're more involved in public advocacy, then you're looking for people who have a bit of name recognition, people who are committed to societal change around whatever issue is your women's rights, environment, trade, whatever the issues that you're running on. And who are willing to come together and make a bit of noise, and make a bit of a splash, and probably over time, perhaps put together a sort of a joint statement which they will release with a considerable amount of fanfare and try and attract attention. And that's a different kind of process. And
even there, excuse me, but even there, the borderline of what would be considered track 3 is not as clear to me. I mean, for example, take these women who march across the border from South Korea to North Korea and have a picnic together or something and basically go home. Now, they're not negotiating at all. They're not trying to work anything out. But it's mostly a public relations demonstration of some kind of willingness to try to overcome some problems, but it's just a symbolic gesture, right?
Right, but somewhere they had to have a discussion to agree to do that. It didn't just happen spontaneously. And so
that's true.
That would be a conversation. I mean, one of the more famous examples that you're talking about was in Northern Ireland. I mean, large groups of women who got together from both sides of the divide and marched and said enough. And it had a significant public impact, and that didn't come out of nowhere. There was a discussion on how are we going to do this, and a movement was born to make sure that whenever extremists were threatening to take the field, a large group of these people would show up and say, no, we don't agree with that. Now, as that was happening, there was a lot of track 2 and track 1.5. And so one of the concepts that we talk about in the field is a phrase known as multi-track diplomacy, which means that a kind of a fully functioning, ultimately successful peace process involves activity on all these tracks. Right, just as the people are quietly talking at the track 1.5 level, people are marching and advocating change, and so the idea being that if you're going to have a fully functioning peace process, there has to be activity on all of these tracks to promote the idea of change at all levels, and it's sort of an ideal in the field of those who study it and think about it that you could design a multi-track peace process. You could design a process where there's activity. Nobody's ever figured out how to do that. It happens spontaneously where it happens, because these tracks are operating at different levels for different purposes, and the people who are noisily advocating change probably aren't interested in talking to or would reject the idea of those who are quietly talking at the track 1.5 level and vice versa, and so the idea of structuring a multi-track approach, and nobody's quite figured out how to do it, but everybody recognizes that in cases where there has been real change in a conflict, real transformation, it's because all 3 tracks made a contribution.
I once participated in something, I don't know whether to call it track 3 or even, I don't know what to call it, but I was active in the Helsinki Citizens Assembly. And it was a group that met toward the end of the Cold War in Eastern Europe, and started between Eastern European democracy advocates and Western peace activists. And I participated in several where there was a guy named Miet-Jan Faber, who was the head of IKV in the Netherlands and very prominent in the HCA. And it was wonderful because he did not speak Russian, but there were I think there were 5 wars going on at the time among the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis and all of these local wars as the Soviet Union was trying to break up, and there were real conflicts between them. So we would sit at a table. And one group would talk about their problem, and they had to slow down to be translated because Miet-Jan Faber was the mediator or the head honcho in that meeting, and he didn't speak Russian. They could speak to each other in Russian or some other language, but they had to stop and let the translation take place. And it was wonderful because that sort of cooled things a little bit, gave them time to settle down a little bit if they were getting hot. But the other thing is, at the same table, there'd be the next group of people who had their issue. And the next group, there were about 3 different conflicts being discussed at the table, and everybody listening into what the other group was dealing with could easily see that their issue was mirrored perfectly in what was going on in this other group. So I was thinking, they would actually get benefit from listening to how the other group was dealing with their issue. And then when their turn came, everybody would listen to them. And it was, I thought, the idea of bringing together people representing at least two different conflicts that are similar should have a lot of value. So I tried to organize something between the Kosovo and Serb, conflict, which was going on at the time, and the Sri Lankan conflict, because the issue, the separatist issue and everything about it, the two issues were very, very similar. And I would think that you could listen and see yourself reflected in that other group. Well, I couldn't get them to sit at the same table. We had preliminary meetings where each side would come and tell us their side, but they wouldn't sit at the table. Never got them to sit at the table. And we went on trying this for a year here in Toronto. And these were just local people. They were not, not officials, but they were. There were people who had fled the country or had some big stake in the outcome. And I don't know. I never, I didn't take your course. It might have turned out differently if I'd taken a course.
I mean, we've done a version of that in more of a track 1.5 setting, which is, we're done now. We can talk about it. It's been written about. We were one of a few groups that was running dialogues between Americans and Iranians at one point, before the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed, which Trump, of course, has since abandoned, but nevertheless. And one of the things that we did and we found useful, because it was nothing to talk about, nothing in common, there's no way forward, blah, 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 was looking at other examples of countries that had bilateral differences over nuclear issues, broader political issues, whatever they were, and bringing people in to talk to this group of Americans and Iranians who, this was track 2. They were not officials, but they were retired officials. They were influential and close to the respective governments. And so I remember one of the things we did was that, as you may know, there's an agreement between Argentina and Brazil, ABAC, which is a special bilateral nuclear control agreement, so each side can inspect each other's, because at one point there was some concern that both of these countries were contemplating going down the nuclear road. So they neither of them was necessarily completely comfortable with the NPT, so they signed a bilateral agreement. And there's a bilateral organization which inspects nuclear plants in both countries. And so we brought an official from ABAC to a meeting we had in Dubai with Americans and Iranians, and he talked about the ABAC experience. And and it was very interesting because the Americans and Iranians, they quickly said, well, that's not really relevant to us. But interesting that, people succeeded in doing something. And so let's take this and even if we initially are having a discussion about why this case isn't relevant to us, we're at least starting to talk about something. And then, again, it becomes an act of the facilitation of saying, well, what would be then, and so, that kind of idea of bringing in people from other conflicts to talk to those in a conflict, it can be very powerful, depending on how you do it and what the circumstances are.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that there had been a lot of that kind of thing going on in Ireland before the settlement a while back. Can you? I'm not too familiar with what all went on. I do know, of course, about these women, and they were very public about their activities. So you're saying that there were backroom conversations.
Oh yes, very much so. Yeah, it's coming out now. There's a scholar in Ireland, Niall O'Doherty, and he's written about it. There was a couple of people. One of the most well-known now, although it was a big secret at the time, was a businessman in Northern Ireland named Brendan Duddy. And he, largely through personal, in his childhood, had connections on both sides. Mm-hmm. And he, over a period of time, and it's a fascinating story how it happened, he became a go-between. And he hosted meetings in his front room of people from the British security services and the IRA, and organized, passed messages back and forth, and over many years at considerable risk. I mean, this was not a risk-free venture on his part, but he established a level of, and this is going to be a funny word for me to use, trust. And I don't mean trust in the sense that the IRA and the British Secret Service, came to like one another, but they began to regard that there were at least some people on each side who, when a message came through Duddy, they could believe it. Even if they didn't like it, at least they could believe it, and there was a level of sort of a secure channel of communication, which was not public and deliberately not kept public. And there were moments in the conflict over the decades when the two sides were fighting one another like cats and dogs, because the tensions had risen and conflict had exploded, and yet they were still quietly talking through Brendan Duddy. And there were others. There was an Irish priest named Father Alex Reid who played this role in some way. And so when the time came to begin the dialogue, which eventually became the talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement, there was at least a cadre of people on each side who understood that it was possible to have a conversation. And even if you didn't like what the other side said, you could at least trust that it was a genuine expression. They weren't trying to con you, right? And that the confidence, very often at the beginning of one of these things, the most important thing to establish is that the confidence of the channel will be respected. Because when you have a situation where the two sides have said that they will never talk to the other side, and they've at the high political level stated that, if it were to become public that they were in fact talking to the side, politicians would be discredited. So very often the first thing, the most important thing, is the fact that they can be trusted to keep the secret of the conversation. And then you go from there to start building further and further trust. It's an interesting story.
I was reading this morning your paper where you were talking about these three different levels of negotiate, or track 2, track 1.5, et cetera. And you refer to the importance of deniability. Now, that could talk a little bit about that. I don't know. I mean, if somebody is doing a conversation, and if the press asks them, and they say no, we're not, I think, I'm going to lose faith in those people. But there's the argument that they mustn't tell the truth in certain circumstances.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you have to start, you raise a very interesting moral question. I mean, if you've publicly stated that it is your policy that you will never talk to the other side, and then you do, and you are, then you're lying to the public, to your own public, and there's a moral argument in there. The counterpart is that, very often in these sort of political situations, the public pressure that a politician or a leader might be under to make a certain statement, because he's got his own party and the opposition movement are, yelling for blood, and we can't talk to these killers and all the rest of it. It's just a political reality. And if the leader didn't, understand that, they wouldn't get a chance to be leader, right? But by the same token, there has to be a way to at least begin to open some doors and explore whether or not there are people on the other side who might one day be the kinds of people with whom one could potentially have a conversation. And so at the sort of most confidential levels of track 1.5, or sometimes called back channels, sometimes for a long period of time, the individuals they're actually not talking to one another. They're both talking to the middleman, Brendan Duddy, or whoever it is who's going back and forth. And so
shuttle diplomacy.
Yeah, or sort of a back channel communication, or whatever you call it. Shuttle diplomacy is often a little more public. You're seen to be going back and forth. But some mechanism whereby at least some very basic level of rapport and trust can begin to be built between, leaderships on the two sides, or some leaderships, to begin to test whether or not, as I say, there are people over there with whom we might one day be able to have a conversation. And so it's a slippery moral slope, right? If you said you'll never talk to these people, and quietly you are, But I think, most people in diplomacy and politics and so on are aware of the need to sort of navigate this. Now, where you have a moral question, I think, as someone who does this, is if you're allowing yourself to be placed in this position and you're going back and forth, are you doing this in the service of the hope that one day change will be possible, which may take a very long time? Or are you helping two groups of very unpleasant people manage their conflict to sort of keep it below a certain level of violence so that they can keep the conflict going and remain in power and not have to change anything? Mm-hmm. And that's a difficult question. And so when you get involved in some of these things, you have to begin to ask yourself, am I acting in a way which may hopefully one day contribute some small piece towards, a new reality? Or am I now becoming part of the furniture of the conflict and part of the landscape and helping these people to keep going? And that's not an easy question. And I'm sure there were many times when Brendan Duddy, that question occurred to him, mm-hmm. But he kept going. And I think you have to have a certain level of faith that eventually things will begin to change, or things may begin to change. And by doing what you've been doing, you're helping to set the ground for that change.
Mm-hmm. Give me an example of a real triumphant track to diplomacy.
Well, again, we look to history because what's going on now is generally not publicly known. But in the 1970s, for example, there was a significant conflict in Mozambique between the government and some rebels backed by the communist world, and it was extremely bloody and difficult conflict. And there was very little dialogue between the two sides. And so a movement based in Italy, the Community of Sant'Egidio, which was affiliated with the Catholic Church, it was a religious organization, gained entry to the conflict largely through the Catholic Church in Mozambique, which tried to, maintain contacts with both sides, and invited people from the two sides to come to their premises in Italy near the Vatican and take part in some dialogue and discussion. And over a period of time was able to foster a sense amongst the people taking part in the conversation that at the end of the day, we're all Mozambicans and we can kill each other wholesale and destroy the country. And then what? What are we left with? I mean, we have to find a way. And so there was a process which gradually led to the emergence of a sense that we have to find a way out of this and made a contribution. Now, eventually, one of the things about Track 2 is that Track 2 never resolves a conflict. Track 2 attempts to get the dialogue between the two sides to a point where official diplomacy takes over. And then, the peace treaty is signed, but it's never signed by the Track 2 people. It's signed by diplomats. Mm-hmm. But you get the people to the point where they can begin having an official conversation. So that's an example that's widely held up in the field. And another one is, again, the case of South Africa. I mean, there was, for all the time that the apartheid government was saying we will never talk to the African National Congress, and the ANC was saying the same thing, people were quietly talking. Mm-hmm. And it culminated eventually towards the very end of the apartheid era in this sort of series of secret dialogues which took place in Britain, sponsored by a British mining company which had interests in South Africa and knew that if the country blew up, they were going to lose a lot of money. So they had an interest in sponsoring a conversation, and they brought together sort of leading people from the African National Congress, including Thabo Mbeki, who went on to become president of South Africa after the apartheid ended, and people who were not of the South African government, the apartheid government, but who were quite influential, people who were members of sort of Afrikaner societies and groups, and people who influenced the South African government. And in fact, towards the very end, the president of South Africa's brother took part in some of these conversations, but I'm just a private citizen, and began to work out the sort of the mechanisms which eventually led to the release of Nelson Mandela and the process of moving towards majority rule in South Africa.
How long did those conversations go on? And typically, when you talk about a track two process, I assume you're talking about something that generally lasts years.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, if you look at the South African case, the talks in the sort of the one sponsored by the English Mining Company, about 18 to 24 months. But the talks before that, 10, 15 years. And if you look again at Oslo, which again you can argue, debatable today how much of we regard as success, but the Oslo process itself took less than a year. But there were people, I mean, one of the famous people in the field is a gentleman, he just passed away a short time ago, named Herbert Kelman, who was a professor at Harvard, who ran a series of these dialogues between Israelis and Palestinians since the 1970s. And they all kind of accumulated towards what became this breakthrough.
Okay, so it's typical then. Now, if you're setting up something, let's say you're taking the initiative, you see a conflict someplace and nobody's working on it, and you decide to own it. You're gonna set up a dialogue. What do you do? Do you contact you go around and take meetings individually with the people that you hear have some influence and ask them if they'd be willing and so on, and then what do? Hire a country house for a week, or how do you, just plain in organizational terms, how do you structure these things?
Yeah, I mean, there are many ways into a conflict, probably as many as there are conflicts. So the question of how you kind of gain access to the conflict it's very often sort of idiosyncratic. In our case, some of the work we've done is the Ottawa Dialogue. It's because people have approached us. Because we have a bit of a reputation, we've done this work and we publish about it and so on. In other cases, it's because of sort of personal connections which some of us have had over the years in a given region, and people say, we need to find a way to talk to someone on the other side. We need to begin a conversation. And so once there is a sense that there are at least some people on both sides who are interested in trying to find a way to have a conversation, then it becomes a question of quietly going and talking to them and spending time with them and visiting them, and so, well, what kind of what realistically could we expect to achieve? How should we set this up in such a way that the people who come from the conflict itself will be comfortable? Because that ultimately, I mean, I will just go home to Canada if this all blows up. They'll have to live with the consequences. So you have to find a way to make sure that there's a high level of comfort. And so you develop a kind of an understanding of, what kind of conversation, at what level, about what subjects, at least initially, who will come, and you spend time.
Typically, for example, I'm assuming that you've actually done this. You personally take the initiative to go and interview people and travel around, and good for you. So now you say, I've got 20 people, and they're going to meet on a weekend, or?
Yeah, no, you probably, depending on the issue, maybe 5 or 6 aside. And generally, or maybe 8 at the most. And generally, you find over time 1 or 2 people each side that you really form a rapport with, and a bond, and a trust, and a deep level of sympathy that you share a goal, right? And with them, you sort of identify a few others. And you try and identify, and this is again at the track 2, track 1.5 level. Track 3 is different. You're looking for civil society advocates, but at this level, you're looking for people who have some degree of influence within the conflict situation. So if you have a situation where on one side, the most influential tiers are sort of political leaders, on the other it's the military, you will have people from those on each side. Right? So they might not be symmetrical, but it's question of people of influence, people who are connected, and people who you are able to share a belief that it's time to begin trying to find a way out of this. Not necessarily a belief that it'll be possible to do so. People may be deeply skeptical, but at least they feel it's time to try. And so when you've got your group of people, then you get your money, go up to the people in governments who sponsor this kind of thing, the Scandinavian countries or whatever, foundations or whatever. You find a place where everybody's comfortable going. We have held meetings in Dubai and Istanbul and Bangkok and different places like that. And you get an agenda agreed, which for the first few meetings is very often simply them talking, coming together and sharing their perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. And you begin the process. And then over time, if you are successful in having a series of meetings.
Now, how many meetings? And the first meeting might be a weekend or 2 months, or how long?
No. 3 days, 4 days at the most.
For about 5 people or 6.
Well, 5, 6 aside. So 12
on each side. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
All right. Okay.
I mean, it varies. It could be more or less, but that's generally sort of between 6 and 8 per side, right? And so you bring them together and you have an initial exchange, and very often at the initial exchange there's a lot of sort of table thumping and anger, and your job as the facilitator is to say, well, no, wait a minute, no, we're here to try and understand this as a problem, not as a we're not here to bargain, we're here to and you constantly gently and there's various techniques, facilitation techniques that you use to bring people around to that perspective, and you build into these interactions, public, not public, events, which meals and little trips, places together, and trying to create an atmosphere of a group, and you have an interesting situation. Very often, I've been in meetings where you find these people who are retired generals from the two sides, and they basically spent their entire lives looking at one another through a gun sight. They never actually met someone from the other side. They never actually sat down with a general from the other side, and so they're fascinated. On one level, they're repelled, but on the other level, they're just fascinated. And I remember having a meeting of people who were former officials from 2 countries. And, it was very stilted and very, they just did their set piece statements and so on. But then over dinner, they began talking about the respective pension systems of their armies. And they were fascinated in, how the pension system worked in the other army, because they were all retired on a pension. So suddenly they were having this marvelous conversation over dinner, exchanging, and that's really interesting. We never knew that, and it sounds kind of silly, but that began to form a bit of an environment, a bit of an atmosphere. And so these things go on and over time. And if you're successful, then over a course of several meetings, over a year, 2, they begin to coalesce into a rather tight group of people who are very committed to dialogue. They're not necessarily yet believing that a solution to the problem is possible, but they come to believe that these individuals they're meeting on the other side are decent people, and that they really should try. And then you're beginning to really make some progress, because then you can really introduce this problem-solving dynamic, and they begin to say, yes, we really want to see this conflict in those terms, and we want to try to understand what can be done about it in those terms. And that becomes a very sort of powerful moment, but it takes time, and it's about building a little community amongst these people as much as anything else.
I don't know what you would call this, but sometimes governments apparently send kind of secret emissaries, just one person, to do some spade work. I'm thinking, for example, I think Norman Cousins was sent to talk to Khrushchev, and he had this secret message or something that he was conveying. I remember hearing, stories about their encounter and so on, and how they got along. But that's not the kind of thing you're talking about. But it is the same purpose. Does that happen very much?
I believe so. Yes, I've heard of instances where it happens, both historically and in contemporary times, where 2 leaders, they feel they have to get a message to one another, and they establish a means to do that. But that, my understanding of I've never been involved in that, but my understanding of many of those kinds of connections is that they're kind of transactional. They're kind of, this is what we're doing, don't be alarmed, this is what we need from you, that kind of specific messaging, which is very useful and very necessary. This is what I'm doing.
One member of Trump's cabinet, a military general or something, former general, was saying something like, when Trump got so out of bounds with threats, that basically he picked up the phone and called his counterpart.
China.
I don't know whether it was North Korea or where it was, but to warn him, to assure him, we will not let this happen. Whatever it sounds like you have reason to be afraid of, we're not going to let Trump do it. Now, I mean, I wouldn't think would be a very common kind of thing to do.
No, I wouldn't think so. I mean, but that's two governments feeling. That's two governments feeling they have to communicate with one another. What we're doing is groups of people who are influential and have connections to government beginning to try and explore a new idea of what a relationship should be.
Which is a slightly different. More of that would go on at the UN, or maybe it does go on. I don't know. I'm not aware that.
Yeah.
That the UN is a particularly fruitful place for breakthroughs. I've never heard of anything.
Well, I mean, the thing is that the UN, everybody who's there is representing their government, right? And when you're in a track one environment, an official diplomatic environment, you have instructions from your capital. Mm-hmm. And as a diplomat, as a representative of a government, you have to fulfill your instructions. Mm-hmm. And often the instructions reflect the politics of the moment. So if the politics of the moment are, we will never talk to these guys, then as a diplomat, you are required to not talk to these guys, whether you're at the UN altogether or not. You just don't, right? Unless you have a secret instruction which says, well, you can talk to them, but very quietly and don't let anybody know about it. But the alternative is to say, our official instruction is we will never talk to these guys, but quietly over here, we've got, 3 or 4 people who are retired, but still highly trusted, and they're talking to these guys in a deniable meeting. Right? And so when Oslo was going on, for example, when Oslo was going on in Norway, there were official Israeli-Palestinian talks going on in Washington being facilitated by the United States government, and they were getting nowhere. Everybody was angry. Everybody was just, trading insults or, standing firm on their positions. And the purpose of Oslo was to explore whether they could get beyond that. But the people in Washington didn't know Oslo was happening. And many of the people in Washington, when Oslo came out, were furious. They said, look, I was there arguing, thumping the table. And they said, yes, you were following your instructions. That's fine. But over here, we were trying to figure out if something else could be done. And so that's not uncommon.
Okay. This is wonderful. Thank you. This has been fun. And I'm so glad you're doing this kind of thing. Yeah, I'd like to know more. So good wishes for whatever. I know you're doing things you're not talking about in this meeting. So good wishes for whatever it is.
Thank you.
All right.
It's been a pleasure. I enjoyed meeting you. And as I say, we have a website, ottawadialogue.ca, and we publish lots of things about how Track 2 works and so on. So I encourage people to visit and have a look.
All right. Terrific. Good to meet you after all these years, Peter. Take care.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces these shows, and this is episode number 534. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. You can share information there also about 6 global issues. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can subscribe for $20 Canadian per year. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see buttons to click to subscribe.